Are African countries too dependent on the IMF and World Bank? The question of whether African countries are too dependent on the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank is complex and has been debated for decades. Here are some key points to consider. 1. Historical context. The IMF is a global institution created in 1944 to foster international financial cooperation. It provides loans to countries facing balance of payments problems, but often these loans come with strict conditions. Fun fact: as of June 26, 2024, Argentina, Egypt, and Ukraine are the top 3 countries that owe the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the most money. The top 3 countries account for 46% of the IMF's total debt. Other countries that owe the IMF a lot of money include Ecuador, Pakistan, Colombia, Angola, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Ghana. Many African nations turned to the IMF and World Bank for loans following independence in the mid-20th century, aiming to finance development projects and stabilize economies. Structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in the 1980s and 1990s often tied loans to strict economic reforms, including privatization, deregulation, and austerity measures. These policies, while addressing immediate fiscal concerns, sometimes led to long-term socio-economic challenges. 2. Benefits of IMF and World Bank assistance. Financial support. These institutions provide vital funding during crises, helping countries stabilize their economies and prevent defaults. Technical expertise. The IMF and World Bank offer technical advice and capacity-building support for implementing economic policies. Infrastructure development. World Bank loans have funded significant infrastructure projects, such as roads, schools, and energy facilities. 3. Dependency concerns. Debt burden. Critics argue that reliance on these institutions has led to unsustainable debt levels. African nations often use new loans to service existing debts, creating a vicious cycle. Loss of sovereignty. Loan conditions can dictate national policy, limiting governments' ability to address local priorities effectively. Economic vulnerability. Policies encouraged by these institutions, such as liberalization and austerity, have sometimes left economies more vulnerable to global market fluctuations. 4. Alternatives to dependency. Regional initiatives. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, aim to boost intra-African trade and reduce external dependence. Diversified financing. Countries are increasingly turning to other lenders, such as China, and exploring innovative financing mechanisms like diaspora bonds or leveraging natural resources. Strengthen domestic capacity. Building robust institutions, improving tax collection, and fostering private sector growth can reduce reliance on external aid. 5. Balancing engagement. While the IMF and World Bank play essential roles in providing financial and technical support, over-reliance can be detrimental. A balanced approach that combines external assistance with strong domestic policies and regional collaboration is crucial for sustainable development. Now, you may be thinking about which countries in Africa borrow the most money from IMF and World Bank. Several African nations rely heavily on borrowing from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank's International Development Association, IDA, for development and economic stabilization. Here are some of the key borrowers. IMF. Angola owes approximately $3.7 billion, used primarily for economic reforms and restructuring state-owned enterprises. Egypt, $9.4 billion in debt, focusing on economic reforms amid political and social challenges. South Africa has an IMF debt of $2.8 billion, taken to address the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Nigeria owes $2.6 billion, used to mitigate various economic challenges, including infrastructure needs. Kenya and Ethiopia both have debts exceeding $2 billion each, directed toward infrastructure and economic development. World Bank's IDA, Nigeria, leads in borrowing with $16.5 billion, focusing on infrastructure, health, and education. Ethiopia, $12.2 billion invested in ambitious infrastructure projects. Kenya, $12 billion for development in roads, ports, and social sectors. Tanzania 11.7 billion primarily for energy and infrastructure projects. Ghana, $6.7 billion mainly for energy and economic stabilization. This heavy borrowing reflects these nations' pressing needs for development funding. However, it also raises concerns about debt sustainability and the potential risks of long-term financial dependency. But do you know that there are some countries in Africa that rarely or never took loans from IMF and the World Bank? There are 3 countries in Africa that have never taken loans from the International Monetary Fund or IMF. What makes these nations unique, and how have they managed their economies independently? Let's find out. 1. Botswana. Botswana is a shining example of resource-driven economic success. Since gaining independence in 1966, Botswana has used its diamond wealth wisely. The government set up the Pula Fund, a sovereign wealth fund, to save and invest resource revenues for future generations. This fiscal discipline and strategic planning have allowed Botswana to avoid borrowing from the IMF, maintaining economic stability and independence. 2. Eritrea. Eritrea's story is different. Since its independence in 1993, Eritrea has followed a self-reliance policy rooted in its history of struggle. The government has resisted foreign aid and IMF loans to maintain control over its economy. While this approach has shielded Eritrea from debt dependency, it has also led to economic isolation and limited development. 3. Libya. Libya's oil wealth has been its economic backbone. For decades, the country used oil revenues to fund infrastructure, healthcare, and education without needing external loans. Under Muammar Gaddafi, Libya's economic policies focused on self-sufficiency and avoiding debt. However, political instability in recent years has presented challenges to this model. Avoiding IMF loans often means avoiding the stringent conditions attached, such as austerity measures that can hurt public services. These countries have prioritized self-reliance and resource management to maintain economic sovereignty. Challenges and future prospects. While these countries have succeeded in steering clear of IMF loans, they are not without challenges. Economic diversification, infrastructure development, and addressing social inequalities remain pressing issues. How they navigate these in the future will be crucial. Closing. Africa's economic story is as diverse as its people. These nations remind us that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to development. Avoiding IMF loans allows these countries to maintain control over their economic policies. IMF loan conditions often involve austerity measures, which can lead to cuts in public services and social unrest. By managing their own resources and budgets, these nations can sidestep these challenges and chart their own paths. The stories of Botswana, Eritrea, and Libya highlight the trade-offs of avoiding IMF loans. While they've maintained independence and avoided debt traps, each faces unique challenges in achieving sustainable development. What do you think? Should more countries follow their example? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of Africa and global economics. Thank you for sticking to the end of this video. See you in the next one.